Hello everyone, and welcome to the ISJL Virtual Vacation. My name is Nora Katz, and I'm the Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. Musical theater is absolutely foundational to who I am as a person, and I'm really interested in the ways in which Southern Jews have shaped and been shaped by this uniquely American art form. It's a theme we'll be exploring in some upcoming, not yet announced virtual vacation episodes, so stay tuned for that. I wanted to kick off this thematic thread with a conversation with Tatiana Wechsler, a New York-based actor, singer, and songwriter who grew up in Atlanta. Tatiana and I spoke back in January, and our wide-ranging conversation covered so many themes in her life and work. The experience of growing up Black and Jewish in Atlanta, her commitment to being a part of new work, and her connections to Yiddish theater, musical theater, and Shakespeare. Throughout our conversation, you'll hear Tatiana's music, much of which was recorded for virtual concerts for the Acting Company and the National Yiddish Theatre Folksbiene. I hope you'll be as captivated by her voice as I am, and that you'll check out all of her work, which is linked in the description of the episode. I think our conversation sheds some new and interesting light on the experiences of Southern Jews in the arts, and emphasizes the importance of creative work during this impossibly difficult time. Without further ado, let's dive into my conversation with Tatiana Wechsler.
I'm Tatiana Wechsler, and I was born in New York and grew up in Atlanta, and then came back to New York. And I am an actor, singer, musician, songwriter occasionally, and artist who... So far, I've worked primarily in theater. I love theater, but I work in theater, on screen, in all sorts of spaces. And I've worked in New York City and across the country regionally, doing all sorts of projects from Shakespeare to Yiddish theater to musicals, revivals, new ones, workshops of new pieces, all sorts of things. And I really love connecting with new work, especially, or at least things with new and fresh perspectives on them. And I guess a little bit more about my family, my background, how I got into it all. My dad is a Jewish guy from the Bronx, who's our family on that side immigrated from what's now Moldova region, his grandparents. And my mom is from Congo, Africa, and she's Jewish too. And so I grew up with all sorts of different influences, African, New York, in Atlanta, but from New York. And the house was always filled with music, and my family was big into the arts, big supporters of the arts. So I always knew this is what I wanted to do, and we would always put on shows at home. And then I went to New York University to study, and that was my path towards the professional career.
I'm hoping you can talk about growing up Jewish in the South, and I know that you have this kind of like New York connection, and I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of how that's connected to Atlanta and what that experience was like.
Yeah. So my family, we were at synagogue a lot. I went to Hebrew school twice a week growing up, and then taught at Hebrew school, and both of my parents taught at Hebrew school on Shabbat. And it was just a very present part of my life, particularly because when I was younger, we were members of Achavat Achim, which was like this older, big synagogue in Atlanta that, I don't even remember all the history about it, but it's one of those where it's like, oh, this one's, been around for a while. And then we were founding members of Or Hadash, which my whole childhood when I was home, the synagogue never had its own building. Now they do, but that wasn't built until after I went to college. So I feel like there's sort of a split half of when I was younger as a kid, I remember like running the halls of this old big synagogue and going to, huge sanctuaries and a really big community. And then we were all of a sudden, in the basement of a church for a long time is where we met. And then we were at other we bounced around. We were at a day school for a while where we held services. Um, and we would have Hebrew school in the basement of someone's house for a while. Um, so that felt like a much closer, smaller community. Um, and in terms of the Jewish community in Atlanta as a whole, uh, to me, it always felt, even though it's pretty large, I think, but it felt quite small because we were so involved in so many things. I played sports at the JCC year round, and I went to some summer camps there, and I never got to go to Camp Ramah, but one of my brothers did for a summer. But we did go, my synagogue, we would go on retreats there. So we'd go there, and then I actually worked one summer at a camp at the JCC. Um, so I always felt like I knew the lay of the land, at least as far as our synagogue was a conservative synagogue. So I feel like I knew about that uh, area of synagogues. Um, and I have so many great memories of my time in synagogue growing up, and just the community as a whole, especially at Or Hadash. Our rabbis are, well, now they're no longer there, but they're Argentinian, and they're a married couple, and they were very young when the synagogue started, so it just felt like sort of injecting a different kind of energy into you know my earlier experiences. There was always so much music. That's my favorite thing about services is the music, clearly. And I loved it at Or Hadash because it was so, everyone sang along, and we would do really like my favorite melodies for everything. Even now, if I try out different synagogues, I'm always like, man, they didn't do my favorite, melody for Adon Olam or whatever. Um, but that's sort of when I think about being Jewish in Atlanta, I think about my synagogue experience, which was so lovely to feel such a part of it. And it felt like a home, even though when I was there, we didn't have our own home. It was just like really supportive, lovely, wonderful people, very deep people, musical people. Yeah, and I mean, there's also a big part of it that's interesting for my story specifically, in that there weren't a lot of Black people, so it's like in general, who at any sort of Jewish things, I feel like my family were the only ones. There were maybe three other people maybe in like my entire experience as a kid who were, and adding that layer on top of growing up in Atlanta, which has a very big Black population, there are just interesting layers to that. Um, but honestly, having my rabbis be Argentinian, it felt like that added extra layers of cultural identity to my experience at synagogue that I felt really connected to. Um, so yeah, so there was always also a feeling of being a bit on the outside, although feeling very much as a member. Um, but also throughout it all, my dad, is very much from the Bronx, and so we never felt like we're Atlantans. It was like, well, we've moved down here, but although I spent my whole childhood there. So that is, I feel like getting to know a lot of people who had Southern roots, Southern Jewish roots. A lot of the people at my synagogue, they have lived in the South for generations, and so that's also a big uh, part of my memories of growing up down there.
The first song that Tatiana will perform for us is Mein Städtele Bells. It's a Yiddish song that is a reflection on what it means to be from somewhere. All of the photos you'll see in the video are of Tatiana's family.
Gestured at this a little bit, but I'm curious about if you can talk about how kind of like African and Jewish culture came together in your childhood or intersected in your childhood, and then how that has kind of contributed to your work as an artist.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because sometimes when I talk about this or think about it, because I don't know anything else, in terms of my own experiences. But I always think of my house as just a big mix of everything, just a lot of things going on all at once. Because, as I said, my mom's from Congo, and she converted to Judaism. And I actually have 3 older siblings who are Christian. That's a longer story. And I have one other sibling who is Jewish. So the house was just full of a lot of things, but we always celebrated Shabbat every Friday. And I feel like what summarizes what the experience was like is like on Shabbat or on certain holidays or celebrations, it's like we would light the candles, say the prayers, and then blast music and dance in the living room. And that music would be everything from like Congolese music, French music, Jewish music, to like Motown, show tunes, R&B, everything, Atlanta hits. So I feel like it was really present, the mix of cultures, in the music that we listened to, the food. I would have beignets one day and pondu, which is this sort of like spinach dish, and challah the next day. So food was very present. And just in terms of, I think there are certain things that overlap. I always think of like respect for elders was very strong in both. And sort of, I feel like a deep questioning and connection to like ancient history, which in many ways I feel like for Black Americans who descended from enslaved people, that's, it's, they can't go as far back into their history. That was taken away from them. So because my mom immigrated, it's like I have this direct connection to my African history. So I feel like I have these deep, long cultural traditions from both. Yeah, so there's a lot of and importance of family. My mom always says some of the things that drew her to Judaism were, well, one was the questioning, because she grew up Catholic and she was always asking, the nuns questions, and they said, stop, you can't ask questions. And so that's I think maybe at the root of my existence, is just the very Jewish question everything. And also my mom connected to the importance of, elders and family and all of those things. And yeah, and how that connected to what I do today. For me, it's been really exciting that I've gotten to do a lot of work that sort of directly connects to my backgrounds. I always think of, I had a stretch a couple years ago where I did a Yiddish operetta, which I can talk about the work I've done in Yiddish later, but that I've done a fair amount of work in Yiddish theater and with Yiddish music, and that's really great because I that's a language my great grandparents and great grandparents spoke, but it didn't get passed down. So to reconnect, and I actually had family members who were in Yiddish theater who I never knew, like cousins, etc., who were hotshots in the Yiddish theater scene. So to be able to connect with that with my Yiddish theater work is really exciting. And I had a year where I did a Yiddish operetta and then went right into a play with an all-Black cast that was actually about Malcolm X. And then I went and I was the first woman to play Curly in Oklahoma. And these were back to back to back to back. And that felt like a very exciting way to touch most of who I am. But yeah, I'm always excited to do pieces that can at least align with some of who I am. It's funny because acting, a lot of the joy in it is getting to be other people. But when you come from different groups that are either underrepresented or the mix of who I am is underrepresented, being able to do that is really fulfilling and makes me think of all the kids who are like me, who would then be able to see me in things. And lately I've had a lot of fun connecting with different artists and friends of mine who are in different groups for Jews of color or Black Jews, or there are a variety of those, and connecting with those folks who are artists has been really fulfilling and cool. And both getting to see their work or be a part of their work, or also just chatting about, hey, what was your childhood like? How was that for you? So yeah, it's all the influences. I think coming from the variety of backgrounds I come from, and also being the youngest child, I think that makes you observe a lot. And so it's no surprise to me that I wound up, being an artist and wanting to tell stories.
That's a fantastic answer to that question. I really am eager to talk to you about musical theater because it's something that's very foundational for me, and I know for you also. And it's also like such a Jewish art form in some ways. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how musical theater came into your life and kind of how you knew you wanted to be a musical theater performer.
Yes. So musical theater came into my life through my dad, primarily. He is a big theater nerd. Even today, it's like I can text him, "Oh, did you hear about this show's coming?" Or like this actor, this performer. But he loves theater. He did some theater growing up in community theater and would go to see shows. So growing up, a lot of what we listened to were musical theater cast albums. We would watch musical films. We would go see shows. And some of my favorite childhood memories are all the shows we would do, which would range from we would make full out videos for certain birthdays, with musical numbers, parody sketches. And probably my favorite is our Passover Seders, which were always the greatest, and full, like the most musical theatery Passover Seder you'll ever see. Just parodies after parodies and updates every year to, stay on top of the trends, and scenes. And I would always invite a couple friends every year, usually non-Jewish friends, to try to, share the experience with folks who'd never done it. And growing up, it was we had puppets, and we would go outside, and we had all these things to reenact props. We had lots of props and costumes, and go around the house, and things set up, and videos. There's a great video of me as a young kid, where my dad was playing Methuselah, I think, in a news report, and I was the news anchor, and I'm wearing like an African head wrap, and I'm 4 years old, and I'm like talking about, welcome to WJEW News. Today we're interviewing Methuselah. So it was always just a part of the experience at home. And so at a very young age, I knew, okay, I want to try this for real. And when I was about 11 or so, I did some shows at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, which is a gorgeous, old, huge, I think 4,500 seat theater. I started doing I was in the kids' ensembles of some professional productions of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat and Beauty and the Beast and High School Musical 2. And that really solidified for me, oh, okay, I want to do this for sure. And then I started, taking more classes and doing the high school shows, and then auditioning for colleges. So it really all stemmed from my dad's love for musical theater.
I love that. It's amazing. You were talking about this a few minutes ago, but can you talk a little bit about like getting into the world of Yiddish music and theater and what that experience has been? And I'm also really curious about how your kind of Yiddish performance experiences have contributed to your work outside of a Yiddish context, and like how those things might intersect.
Mm-hmm. My first experience with Yiddish theater as a performer was in 2015. I just saw a random audition notice for the National Yiddish Theatre Volksbühne. They were doing an operetta, and I said, oh, I've never worked in Yiddish before, but growing up, it's, you hear some Yiddishisms and occasionally hear some Yiddish songs. I also studied German growing up in school. That was just the language we were taught, and I went to Hebrew school. So I said, oh, I feel like this would actually be easier for me than maybe a number of other languages. I grew up in a very multilingual home. We grew up speaking French at home as well, and there were a number of other African languages spoken at home. So working in multiple languages is always exciting to me and always feels comfortable. So I saw an audition notice. I said, let me go down. And then I got the show. And so it was not a planned, I want to pivot into doing Yiddish theater. It was just like, there's an audition, let me try it out. But I really, really enjoyed doing it. And I think thankfully, because of my backgrounds in German and Hebrew, it made it so that I wasn't just saying a bunch of sounds for myself. I can't speak Yiddish fluently, but I can understand it for the most part. and if I'm learning lines for something, I know what every word means. So that really helps a lot. So I did that show with them, and then we did it again the following year. It was very successful. And then after that, I did a couple other concerts with them. And because the Yiddish music world is pretty small, after that, I just sort of started meeting other people. And especially since COVID, I've done a lot of sort of at home concert Yiddish work. And that has connected me to a wider range of people as well, which is really exciting. And it's something I sort of have stumbled into, but it's fun to both connect with the older, rich history of it, and to also see, okay, what are folks doing now? Like what's happening now, and what's new in Yiddish theater and music.
I love that. I think one of the first performances of yours that I saw was you doing a Yiddish Oklahoma medley,
Yeah.
which is so wonderful. And I'm wondering if you can talk about being the first female curly in Oklahoma and kind of how that came about.
Yes. So in 2018, I played Curly in Oklahoma at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. And that also, it started off as just a random audition. Um, but I had actually heard about this production. They'd announced it months before. And the director, Bill Rausch, who was at the time also the artistic director of Oregon Shakespeare Festival, had this vision for years and years, I think 25 years or so. He wanted to do a version of Oklahoma that switched the gender of certain characters and then made some of the couples same sex, and just really opened up the possibilities of it. But he never thought that the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate would allow it. But then he built a relationship with Ted Chapin, who was at the time the head of the organization, and one point a number of years ago just asked, hey, what do you think of this? And Ted said, show me, and then we'll see. And he put together a reading of it, or a concert presentation of it, and Ted said, okay, do it, go for it. Which is really exciting that the folks who hold the rights to these older pieces allowed the opportunity to see it in a new light. Because I'm a strong believer in, if you're going to revive something, why are you doing it now? You know, what about it is relevant for now? And so I auditioned and I got the job, and it was really, really exciting and fun and fulfilling and difficult and a lot of pressure, and ultimately fun and rewarding, so rewarding. We had to work a lot to see how much to say and how much didn't need to be said, in terms of the messaging and the story we were telling it with this version. The script, we mostly only changed pronouns, or like girl, boy, that kind of language. But nothing else really was changed. And so we found ultimately the most powerful way to tell the story was just, we've cast it with this group of people and just let them tell the story. And it was so exciting. The audiences were amazing, and it was so cool to see the range of responses from young folks who were so thrilled to see themselves represented on stage, to older folks who never thought they could see themselves in this kind of piece, or who loved the show all their life, and then people who just loved the show and thought this was a fun version of it. Yeah, ultimately my favorite audiences though were the student audiences, because it was so sweet to hear them rooting for us and rooting for the characters. I remember there's a scene where Curly is proposing to Lori, and one time we could not get through the scene because they just kept applauding and screaming. It was like I made one move and they cheered, and it was so exciting to see them so engaged with theater and an older piece, seeing how they could connect to that. And also what was cool was we were able to also, by keeping it set, we kept it set in the original time period, but it was sort of a utopian version of that time period. But the truth is, the message we were sending was that folks like this have existed forever and were there in that time period. And actually, if you look at the history of the territory at that time, in the early 20th century, there was a lot of diversity, and before it became an official state. And so having that dramaturgical rooting in actual history of, that gave it an extra weight. And it was fun. It was stressful, because if you know that show, it starts off with Curly singing a solo. And so the second I stepped onto the stage, I knew I was carrying sort of the weight of the conceit of the production, and that I had to get everyone on our side immediately. So I was very nervous every time. I thought maybe I could run away. Every time I was like, I could just run out the doors or do the show. Thankfully, every time I chose to do the show, and it was so fun. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about how, like, Oh, What a Beautiful Morning is so much pressure, because it's just you're just alone out there.
Yes, and it was such a bold way to start a show historically. That Rodgers and Hammerstein chose to start a show that way. But then with the added layer of that production, it was very stressful, but so much fun.
Here is the Oklahoma medley that was my first introduction to Tatiana's incredible voice.
Chickens, Katschkes laufen in a hurry, wenn ich nehm dich aus in mein Sorry. Sis a Britschke, schein keine Hurry mit der Fringe auf den Top. Der Fringe presst sich witzig und bettlich, wenn ich treib mir meine Schäne fettlich. Mechanismen mich mit die Fettlich, ich geb sehr, ach ab. Die Räder, Gele, der Sitz ist bräun, wie samet aus Kerperglätter. Fenster fin Glas fin Neuben an, weil Tomer beit sich der Wetter. Zwei schöne Lämplich, was winken und blinken, fin die Podloves fliehen die Finken. Man kann sich fin der Luft nicht und trinken, wo's es geht. Ach, ab mit mein schöne kleine Britschke mit dem Fringe auf den Top. Oh, es hat a schöne Frühmorgen, es wird euch der Tag ein sein schön. Warf in sich die Sorgen, mein Mädele kommt ein zu gehen. Oh, es hat a schöne Frühmorgen, es wird euch der Tag ein sein schön. Warf in sich die Sorgen, mein Mädele kommt ein zu gehen. Mein Mädele kommt ein zu gehen.
I'm kind of like following this through line of revisiting classics, and I've noticed that a lot of times in your work you're referencing Shakespeare, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your like connection to Shakespeare and maybe how Shakespeare informs your work.
Sure. I think, again, sort of something I sort of stumbled into, which is maybe that's the other through line is, nothing has gone as planned, and that's wonderful. And I wouldn't ask for it to be a different way. I did in school, I studied at NYU, and we did have a year that was a bit more Shakespeare focused, but I don't think I actually did a full Shakespeare production in school. I just did some scene work and studying and monologues. And then when I was out of school, I worked a number of times with the acting company, which is when it was started, it was primarily a touring company that would share classical works. And it was started by graduates of Juilliard, like Kevin Kline and Patti LuPone. And so a couple years after I finished school, I auditioned for some of their productions. There were some of my NYU faculty were sort of connected to folks at the company, and that helped me get in there. And earlier I mentioned a play about Malcolm X, and that was my first time working with them. We did a play called X, or Betty Shabazz versus the Nation by Marcus Gardley. And we did that in rep with Julius Caesar, which was very exciting because there were a lot of overlapping themes. And it was the same company, the same 10 actors. It was an all-black cast of 10 actors. And we toured the country, and then we did the Malcolm X play off Broadway as well. But that was my first time in a professional Shakespeare production. And what I loved about that was that it was a 90-minute version, and we were playing multiple characters. And it felt, because of that, it felt so sort of visceral and present. And my way in was the language again. As I spoke about, I like working in other languages. To me, whenever I'm working in Shakespeare, it feels like a similar brain switch as when I'm working in another language, which is really exciting to me. I just love that. So I did Julius Caesar, and then I also, when I was doing Oklahoma at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, I was also working in rep, and I also did Love's Labour's Lost by Shakespeare, which that is the most fun I've ever had in a show. We had a wacky production with songs, and we paint and costume changes, and like that to me was made me realize, oh my gosh, Shakespeare can be so much fun, and it should be. The comedies are supposed to be fun. I think sometimes there's a notion that we can get stuck in the old language of it all and not see all of the rich humor that can be there. But perhaps my most enlightening experience with Shakespeare was again with the acting company. I did a touring production of Othello, and this was a school touring production in New York City. And we went to all kinds of schools, from like private all boys schools to schools that they called sort of like last chance schools, to like middle schools, all over the city, multiple boroughs. And that was again a condensed version of the show, and I played multiple characters, so I was so exhausted. But that was fascinating, because to be able to see so many young kids just so enthralled by the piece, or to see what they reacted and responded to. I mean, sometimes it was, the action or the deaths that was exciting, but they really were listening, and I loved. My favorite moment was at one point Desdemona is, in her room, and she hears Othello, but she thinks it's the wind, and she said something like, "Is that the wind?" And a student yells, "That's not the wind, girl. Look behind you." Just having that sort of presence and interaction with the work was really exciting. I also tell people all the time, and I told the students, we would have a lot of talkbacks, that if you don't like Shakespeare now, that's okay. If you never like Shakespeare, I think that's okay too. I think there's sometimes a weight put on Shakespeare that you have to love it, and it must be the greatest thing ever. And if you don't love it, then you're not smart. I think all of that is very untrue. I think there are ways to find your way into Shakespeare's work. And I think I've been fortunate to be a part of productions that do that. And the language really is beautiful. But I always tell people, if you don't like it, that's okay. But I have really enjoyed working, and that was a surprise to me. I never really expected that I'd be doing a lot of Shakespeare.
Here is an original song with some lyrics by William Shakespeare and some inspired by August Wilson. It's about many things, but mostly about empowerment.
Signaling to the ones who've been balancing all the weight of the world on your soul. Echoing to the hearts who've been of the lives of this world you are born. Who is like you in this wide, wide world? There is but one of you, and your spirit knows no limits, so it lives and breathes in all you do. All your acts are revolutionary. All your acts are undeniable. All your acts are extraordinary, something remarkable. All your acts are queens. 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 All your acts are. When you speak sweet, I'd have you do it ever. When you sing, I'd have you buy and sell so. So give alms, praise so, praise so. When you do dance, I wish you a wave of the sea, a wave of the sea, that you might ever do nothing but that. Each you're doing so singular in each particular crowns what you are doing in the present deed, that all your acts are queens. All your acts are revolutionary. All your acts are undeniable. All your acts are extraordinary, something remarkable. All your acts are queens. 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 The ground on which you fight is now shaken. The world that we've imagined is taking hold. Move still, still so. The ground on which you stand here is blessed. The ones who came before pass the message on. Move still, still so. The ground on which your roots will be rising demands that we can't be compromising, no. Move still, still so. The ground on which we build on together sings freedom in a new rhyme and letter, yes. Move still, still so. All your acts are revolutionary. All your acts are undeniable. All your acts are extraordinary, something remarkable. All your acts are queens. 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 Are queens. Dear friend.
In addition to like being involved in all of these different sort of productions of classics and revivals, you also are involved in a ton of readings and workshops of new work. And I'm wondering if you can talk about why that is, what that experience is like, and sort of what it means for you as a performer.
Yeah, I think ultimately my favorite thing is working on new works. Um, and some of that is because to be able to be in the room with the writer and to all be telling the story at the same time together. I just love the collaborative nature of theater. I love art that is collaboration. And there's always sort of a missing piece if you're not doing a new work. Um, I think I've really got into it because of NYU. NYU, I had a wonderful experience. And one of the things that's amazing about it is because it's in the city, you get access to a lot of working professionals. Um, so through the NYU connection, I met a lot of new writers. And then also NYU has a graduate musical theater writing program. And my training program directly, we had classes together with them. So I got to know new writers from the ground up. And I constantly work with folks from that program. So just being in the city, you get to know writers, and they'll ask you to do a little reading, and then someone will see you in that and ask you to do another reading. So I just love doing that. But I've also gotten to do a couple full-on productions that were new. I one of the more recent ones is releasing a cast album very soon. It was announced today that the cast album will be released later in February, that we recorded, and that's really exciting to be able to have recorded a cast album of a new show that's always been a dream of mine. And that's a show called Love and Hate Nation by Joe Iconis that was done at Two River Theater in New Jersey. Yeah, ultimately it's just always my favorite thing. It's being able to create a character. I've done shows. I did a show called Benny and June that's based on the movie. We did a musical version of that at Paper Mill Playhouse. What was cool about that is I wasn't creating the character from ground up necessarily. The character had been made, but we very much had moments that are like in movies of, the show's almost open, we're in previews, we need to write you a new song. And I remember I had a solo song that was constantly being rewritten, and it would be previews, and they're like, we wrote a new ending to it, you got to put it in the show tonight. The classic like high stakes theater moments. And that was so exciting and scary, but exciting. And another thing about new theater is that we're getting to tell stories of underrepresented people is more likely with new writers. I think that's something that's so needed, and to be a part of works that are more representative is fulfilling.
You've really helped me with a segue, which is I feel like another through line in your work is sort of this commitment to justice and equity and lifting up underrepresented voices. And I'm wondering if you can talk about like what that looks like in your work as a performer.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, there are a couple different angles of it. For me, when I'm doing work as myself, so maybe songs that I write or concert kind of work, I think I'm trying to always honor the communities I'm a part of, and also the communities that I'm not a part of. And so that can be anything to like, who do I ask to collaborate with, or who can also be a part of the storytelling with me, whether it's just a song or a bigger piece. And always thinking of both childhood me or the child version of me, what would she have wanted to see? And also everyone who is existing now. So what that looks like is sort of, I feel like it's hard for me to think about how to quantify it, but for myself. But when it comes to being a part of pieces that other people are creating, I think it's seeing, is this a room I want to be a part of, whether I know the people or not already. And if it is a room that I'm a part of, feeling emboldened to speak up when necessary. Because I feel like in my past, I've been a part of things where that's something I'm learning and I'm getting better at. There are times I think where maybe I should have spoken up or I didn't speak up in a way I wanted to, and I'm feeling better and better about that. So just always feeling like I have a voice in whatever room I'm in. And that can be about the storytelling, what are we doing in the telling of the story. That can be about anything backstage, how things are communicated, how the more business side of things goes. Because that's been really tough to learn as I went from a kid who just loved the arts for loving the arts, and then someone who's been making a career out of it and a profession. Is the business side of it all can be really disheartening and sad, and trying not to get fully disheartened by that and disillusioned, and seeing that there's so many people doing so much good work out there now. I think especially over the last few years, in the theater scene, in particular, there are a bunch of different organizations now that are devoted to equity and justice in all the parts of theater making. And so I look to them to see what they're doing, and I look to my friends who are running organizations or at the head of organizations, and I think ultimately it's, who am I in the room with, who is in my community or my communities, and remembering to use my voice.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. In the past few years, I think, for a very long time, but really especially in the past few years, I think there's been so much conversation and development in terms of wanting there to be more diversity in the theater world from every perspective, because I think even as we see shows that have, majority Black casts, like all the people in the business end are white still, and like that dynamic is really complicated. And I'm wondering, how you've seen that kind of conversation unfold and what you hope is going to emerge from all of this. That's a big question, but
yeah, I mean, it's so tricky because it still feels like, where are we in the state of live performance and COVID? It's just, I don't know where we are. And there are certain things that have been really exciting, and then certain things that make me feel like, oh, have we learned nothing? So it's hard to see where we are with that. But I do think the conversations have been raised a lot more than ever before. And that's something I've heard from other people within rehearsal rooms. I've heard some folks say, we may not have all the answers yet, but I've been in the business for X amount of years and we never had these conversations before. So that's promising that, we're talking about these things. I think one big thing is looking to new and unproduced writers, and trusting that if you think the work is good, that it's important to be put on. It's I'm not a producer. I've learned a bit about how producing works recently, and I don't know what it's like to, invest a lot and put all that at stake. But to me, I think it's in, the producers need to give things a shot. And something doesn't have to have been seen before to be worthy of being produced. So I'm hoping people producers are daring, and that also producers get very diversified. There are cool, I know some folks in some various producing initiatives and organizations that are giving teaching experiences, I guess, or internships or jobs to folks to learn about producing from a variety of backgrounds. And that we keep, expanding the kinds of stories. It's not just enough to just have, maybe like one Black play. It's, are there trans folks, non-binary folks, folks of all sizes and colors and faiths and everything who are getting to tell stories. And it's so hard because I feel like when I say this, I'm like, I don't know what we need to do, but that's why I believe in my friends. I believe in my artist friends. I believe in the folks. I don't want to say just my generation. That's not very true, but the folks I know of multiple ages are doing the work, and I think just need to be given the opportunity to do the work on bigger stages.
In your concert you did for the acting company Dear Friends, I guess it was in 2020, you talked about the need to have Black joy in your music. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that and why that's so important.
Yeah. It's funny thinking back to that concert because I did that in the summer of 2020, which was, of course, such a charged time. And even thinking back to how I was feeling, I'm like, there was such an undercurrent of just anger and sadness and disappointment, just with everything on top of everything, plus just the being stuck inside of it all. That I just remember thinking when I was planning that concert, there has to be joy. There always has to be joy. And I did one song in particular with two friends of mine from Oregon Shakespeare Festival who are wonderful artists and are both Black. And it's just about always, I think, finding the light, finding the joy, finding the music. And I think something I'm finding for myself as both a person and an artist is allowing everything, in that I don't need to ignore the fact that things are difficult, especially that summer of 2020. When I think back, I'm like, that was a hard time. It's still hard times, but that was a particularly challenging time. And I didn't want to ignore all of that or push it aside. But that, I find that there's a lot that I'm always thankful for, a lot for me to be thankful for. And there are a lot of the narratives that are told for Black stories are full of trauma. And I wanted to do something joyful. And I hope for stories about Black folks in all entertainment as they continue is just to have them be fully rounded and real in whatever that means. So it's not that they need to be all joy all the time, but that shades of everything and shades of nuance are allowed. But I love being able to spread joy with music in particular, but with art. And if it makes someone smile, that's great.
Here is Tatiana Wechsler performing Carry You, an original a cappella song she created for the group The Blueprint, an organization that provides training for artists who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Do you feel how beautiful you are? Your hair, your skin, your shape, your words, your spark. It's in the marrow of your melody, the message of your memory, the handprint of your history is there to hold you whole. Carry it with you. Carry carry them with you. I'll carry it with you. You carry them with you. Phenomenal woman, burden caged, rewrite the page and sing your truth. Phenomenal woman, burden caged, you take the stage and set the cues. Phenomenal woman, burden caged, you carry me, I carry you.
I feel like that kind of dovetails with, I think, often the way that people also learn about Jews is like, if we're talking about Black people, we're going to talk about slavery. If we're talking about Jews, we're going to talk about the Holocaust. And it's like, okay, but people are also human beings. And
Yeah.
there are so many dimensions to being a person. And one of them is joy and music.
Yes, and there's so much history beyond that for Black folks and Jewish folks and the people who are both too. You know, it's like there's so much variety in history to all of those things. No group of people are a monolith. And there's so many communities. I have a friend who's he's a Black rabbinical student who's brilliant, and Kendall, and I remember him talking about how he likes to think of the communities as communities. You know, when people say, "Oh, but what is the Black community? What is the Jewish community?" And he's like, "That's not really true, because you can't narrow it down to that." So it's like when I think of all the communities that are a part of these groups, there's so many layers and richness and varieties, and everyone should be able to tell their stories from all the communities.
Speaking of telling stories, I'm really working hard for this segue. But you are also a songwriter, and I'm wondering if you can talk about like your songwriting process and how that sort of plays a role in your life too.
Yeah, that's been really fun to me. I've always my whole life, been writing little songs, or if I had a school assignment where writing a song was even a slight possibility, I did. I remember I had a calculus for extra credit. We could do something creative, and I wrote a love song to calculus. And so I was always just putting together songs. But it never had been my main focus, or my main way of getting work. I've done a lot of musical work, but not my own songwriting. And so actually getting to do the concerts that I did in 2020 and the last few years was really a great tool for me to get some songwriting done. I was given a deadline, and I picked up a lot of new skills. That was something that one of the benefits of 2020 for me was I got some equipment, and I taught myself some basic, music editing and video editing. And I played piano growing up, and, I read music, and I'm comfortable doing a variety of musical things. So being able to actually sort of see that through, because I have so many half-written songs, unfinished songs, but to be able to finish them was really exciting, and that's something I want to keep doing. I'd love to record, an EP and an album, and hopefully soon that is something I will really accomplish. And songwriting to me is always so mystifying. And the more I read about how other writers work, I think, okay, I'm not alone in that I do have a particular method. It's, sometimes a melody and a lyric will just pop in my head, and I'll write it and record it. Sometimes just words will pop in my head, and I'll write them down, and then I'll later revisit that and think, oh, is this a song? Or vice versa, just a melody, and then I add words to it. But it's always sort of elusive until the puzzle pieces fall together, and I don't know what the puzzle will be, for the most part, unless I've had a couple songs that I've had sort of like assignments to write, like I'm writing a song about this event or this thing, and that helps structure it a bit. But it's a strange process, and I love hearing about how other people's do, how their songwriting processes work as well. The short answer is I don't really know, but I usually have a thesaurus pulled up, and sometimes a rhyming dictionary, and I might, be messing around on the piano, playing with chords and melodies, or the ukulele, and then eventually it just happens somehow.
Yeah, I think the mystery of it is like part of what makes it so captivating. Is like, I don't know what to tell you. Here it is.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
How do you know what to do to make my day before I wipe the sleep from my eyes? How do you know what to say to make me stay long after the sun's begun to rise? You got my devotion, you got that drive, you set me in motion, you make me feel alive. Oh, how do you know? How do you know? How do you
Enormous thanks to Tatiana Wechsler for sharing her time and talents with us. This was such an illuminating and inspiring conversation for me, and I hope you loved it as much as I did. You can learn more about Tatiana's work on her website, which is linked in the description of this episode. catch Tatiana on the newly released cast album of Joe Iconis' Love and Hate Nation, and see her on Broadway in the new musical Mr. Saturday Night, which has its first preview tonight. Off camera, Tatiana and I talked a lot about how important it is to support artists in this time, especially artists who perform live. Music and theater are so important, especially right now. Any way that you can support friends and people in your community who are performing artists, whether it's donating to arts organizations you care about or buying tickets to shows, I hope that you'll do it. This project was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The next episode of the ISJL Virtual Vacation premieres on Tuesday, April 26th. It's a deep dive into the history of Southern Sephardic Jews, with a focus on the Sephardic communities in Atlanta and Montgomery. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for more stories from the Jewish South.